Hi guys, this is Mark. In this lecture, we will be talking about running database queries. We have touched on that subject a couple of times in the previous lectures. However, the whole querying mechanism in Backendless, in UI Builder, Codeless, and in the Backendless database is very rich. So it definitely deserves its own lecture, or maybe more than one. To get started, I will create a new page. And this page will be created from the data table example right here, this template right here. Let's call it data query 1. Click create. The reason I selected this template is because it is quite convenient for the reason that the where clause element right here is built in, and this where clause will drive the actual query for the data displayed in the data table. A couple of words about the where clause. The history behind the where clause concept goes back to the days when Backendless was just a backend platform. In SQL, whenever you run a query, and SQL is a structured query language used to extract data from the database. In fact, SQL stands for Structured Query Language. There is a part of an SQL query called where part. And then in there you put the actual condition that defines what kind of data needs to be retrieved from a data table. And that part of an SQL query is called where clause. In Backendless, the where clause follows exactly the same syntax that you would use in SQL. So if you are familiar with SQL, you will feel very comfortable creating your where clauses to retrieve data from the Backendless database. If you're not, there are plenty of resources on the internet, and it is actually quite intuitive once you start working with it to see how it works. And with UI Builder, it is very visual too, so you can instantly see what kind of data you are getting back. And that's exactly what I will be demonstrating today. To get started, select the data table in that page and select the table called country. When you select the table, Backendless UI Builder automatically pulls in all the columns that exist in the selected table. We do not need all the columns, so we can go into the configure, click the configure button for the columns to eliminate some of the columns that we do not need, such as updated, created, owner ID, object ID. All other ones could stay in there. By the way, move name to the very top because that really clearly differentiates one country from others. Local name could also be eliminated. We do not need that. So click apply. We will have fewer columns now, and at this point the page is ready to run, and which is exactly what we're going to do. However, before we do this, what I would like to point out is in this lecture we will be playing with the where clause, and in here it directly applies to the data table. But you may be wondering, well, I may not be using data table in my application. What is where clause good for in my app? Well, in your app, whenever you're building an application with UI Builder, if you go to logic, and if you look into any kind of logic, I'm just randomly going to click to create an event handler. And let's take the block that retrieves data, which is load table objects located in the data API. In here, there are a lot of parameters. In this lecture, we're focusing on where clause, which is the primary query, primary condition that you provide into this block that defines what kind of data objects you want to retrieve back. As you can see, there are a lot more parameters, such as having clause, relations, properties, relations depth, paging support. So there are a lot of options, and many of these options will be covered in other lectures. However, where clause perhaps is the most important one that you will be working with. So that's exactly what we're focusing on. What you will see in the demo that I will be running, you will see various types of examples for where clause. So whatever you will learn in there will be directly applicable to whenever you use this block to compose your where clauses. So even though we're not using this block in this particular lecture, whatever you will learn is still applicable, and this is where you will be using it. So let me delete this event handler. We don't really need it, and go back to our user interface. So at this point, as I said, it is ready and we can just start running it. Something else that I should have done is make the table taller, because right now it shows only a few of the countries, like depending on the height of the row, and there is plenty more space on the page. So let's actually make this change. Select the data table, go into dimension, and let's set the height to maybe 70%. I think that should be sufficient. And let's set the max height to 70% as well. And rerun the page. That's better. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the basic ways to use the where clause. As you can see, the structure of this data table that we display here is it contains columns, and each column has a name. The names of these columns will actually be mapped to the properties. So whenever you retrieve data from your country table or any other table, whatever the column names are, those column names become properties. So if you retrieve a specific country object, and then there is a column called continent or name or government form or any other column here, then that object will have property which has exactly the same name as the corresponding column name. So if we take a look at this object right here, country Albania, and the continent column says Europe, so the object itself will have property continent with the value Europe. So with that being said, let's take a look at how we can structure some very basic where clause queries. For instance, we want to retrieve all the countries where continent is North America. Naturally, and it seems rather natural to me, what you will need to do is you're going to say continent equals, and you put North America in single quotes. As soon as you do this, this where clause goes into the query that is sent to the server, and now we retrieved all the countries, and there are 35 of them, right? So actually so there are 35 countries in our database that are in North America. And if you want to do Europe, just change it to Europe, and now we got 46 countries from Europe. What if you want to get countries that are both in Europe and North America? What you will do is this: continent equals Europe, or continent equals North America. And in this case, we got the countries both from Europe and from North America. Let's say you want to get all the countries where the population is greater than a certain number. What you do is this: population greater, and specify the value. So as we increase the population, we get fewer and fewer countries. So right now, 153 countries where the population is greater than 1 million. Well, how about 10 million? There are 77. And as you can see, the number of countries becomes smaller and smaller. What if you want to get countries where the population is greater than, in this case, 1 million, and continent equals North America? Then that works as well. What if you want to get population greater than 1 million, continent North America, or surface area is of certain value? You can actually start grouping it in parentheses. Or surface area greater than some number. Then this will be respected as well. As you can see, the principle is very basic. You reference a column, you compare it to something else, you can start grouping it, you use the AND or operators to combine these parameters together. What if you need to search countries that match certain patterns? For example, you want to find all the countries that start with the letter A. And in this case, what you do is this: name, like, you open a single quote because it's going to be a string, put in A, and then to replace everything else that follows A, you put the percent character, close it. Now, this will match any country that starts with A, and then the percent sign matches everything else. If you want to countries that start with AN, you do this AN, and now we got all these countries. And just like this, you can start adding other parameters as well. As you can see, it is very, very simple principle. For example, if you want to check for ranges, let's take this independence here. So let's get all the countries who got their independence in the first 20 years of the 20th century. So what you put is indep year greater than 1900 and in-depth year less than 1920. So that gives you the range, and you got all those countries. So the language is very flexible, and I believe it is very intuitive. Of course, things can get more complicated, especially once you start working with relations. And I will demonstrate a couple of those queries as well. But generally speaking, I believe it is very intuitive to work with this query language. Let's take a look at the relations. Before we do this, I will switch back to Backendless Console and go to Backend. And what I would like to demonstrate is that in the country table, there is only one relation, capital. And then there are no other relations. In fact, it's easier to see in the schema. So in the schema, you see there is data relation to table city, and that's through the capital. However, if we go to city, there is a relationship to the related country through the column called country. This is quite beneficial because now we can find a country that a particular city belongs to. Let me demonstrate how this works with Backendless. So we know that the city table has a column called country. So what we can do is this: city, country, and the city table has property name. So if we select, for example, Paris, what this does is it says for the city that is related to a country, because we're looking for a country, where the city name is Paris, find me that country. And it finds that country, and we know it is France. Right here. So if we want to find all the countries where the city name starts with letter P. There you go. So these are all the countries that have a city that start with letter P. If we go back to city, we can actually query on all the properties that are in the city. So we can find all the countries that have cities where the population is greater than a certain number. This is what it would look like. City.country population greater than, so there you go. So these are all the countries that have cities where the population is greater than 1 million. There are 63 countries. So this is pretty cool because you can base your queries not only on the data that is in this table, but on the data that is in the related tables, and that becomes extremely powerful. And then here you can actually combine all of these with some of the properties in here. So for example, where the city population is greater than 1 million and independence year is greater than 1900. So here we're combining related property value with a value that is in the country table. I think this may already become overwhelming, but I hope you got the idea of how where clause gets structured. There will definitely be other lectures on this because there is a lot more to talk about, including aggregate functions where you can retrieve data and have the database aggregated. Like for instance, if we want to find how many countries are in each continent, or get the countries with the highest life expectancy or the smallest life expectancy. All of this is definitely possible out of the box, strictly just by playing with the querying mechanism in Backendless. But for now, I'm going to stop, and I would like you to try the same queries. You can install this database and get the table just by getting the link in the description for this video and installing it in your Backendless installation, and you will be able to repeat all the same things. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, happy codeless coding.